order the March 10th Policy and Innovation Committee meeting. All right, let's start that again. Good morning. I'd like to call the March 10th meeting for the Policy and Innovation Committee to order. We do not have any members participating via Zoom today, so that makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead and begin. The first item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Will you please stand and join me in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so very much. Next item on the agenda, Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you. Good morning. Director Andreatta,
Here.
Kraftling,
Here.
Gallardo,
Here?
Kennedy, absent McCauley,
Here.
Rodriguez, Schaefer,
Here.
soon absent Veerkamp, Vice Chair Vega, and Chair Dowden Calvillo.
Present.
Thank you.
Let the record show that we do have a quorum for the purposes of our meeting this morning. Oh, that's Vice Chair. Next item on the agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for any member of the public to address the committee on items not on the agenda. We can't take action on said items, but we can refer them to staff for subsequent discussion at a noticed meeting. With that said, I'd like to open public comment. Is there any public comment at this time?
There's no public comment.
All right, seeing that there is none, close public comment and move on to disclosures. This is an opportunity for any member of the committee to disclose an item under the Levine Act. Are there any disclosures?
No, ma'am.
Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item, which is consent. I would like to remove item 1 from the consent agenda, just to make a quick change. Are there any other changes to the consent agenda as proposed at this time? Any questions? Madam Clerk, any public comment on consent agenda?
No public comment.
Seeing none, what's the pleasure of this committee?
I'll move for approval.
Second. It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Chair Dowden Calvillo. Since all of the committee members are present, we can actually just do a
A
majority
voice vote. Okay, I
Yeah.
thought when there were resolutions, we had to do a voice. So it's separate.
No,
City
we're
council,
okay.
we have to do voice. Okay, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. All right, let the record show that the motion has been adopted unanimously to approve the consent agenda as amended. For item number 1, the minutes, just a quick little change. The call to order was Chair Dowden Calvillo. So just quick change. Any other discussion or changes to the minutes? Any public comment on the minutes?
There's no public comment.
All right, is there a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
Move approval. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. The record show that the minutes have been adopted unanimously. Moving right along, we're going to go to action items, and the next item on the agenda is to approve the draft budget and overall work plan for fiscal year 25-26, and to adopt the salary schedule, hold a hearing on the vacancies. I'll go ahead and defer to staff. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. Loretta Sue, SACOG Finance Director. So the draft budget and overall work program for fiscal year 2025 and 26 is ready for board actions. So this morning, I'm going to briefly highlight what's included in the overall work program, that including timeline and work plan activities, and then also briefly go over the budgets, including revenue sources, and then, the proposed budget for fiscal year 25-26, and then give a little bit more information regarding the fund balance. And lastly, included in this action item also the revised salary schedule and public hearing on agency vacancy, which Eric will touch a little bit more on that later. Sorry. Okay, let me just start off with the overall work program and budget. What is overall work program? SACOG, as a metropolitan planning organization, received federal funding for planning out the activities. So as required by federal and state regulations, SACOG must prepare an overall work program, also known as an OWP, which I will be using throughout this presentation, and budget each fiscal year, which document all transportation planning activities for the regions. And some of the activities, obviously, the LWP is more detailed than a typical budget because it includes all the transportation activity for the regions, and also is the best source of overall detail about SIGCOG fiscal work plan. And finally, the OWP and budget does require board adoption and also approval from the state and federal agency before expenditure can incur starting a new fiscal year, which is July 1st of each fiscal year. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the timeline in terms of the development of the OWP and budget. In February, end of February, staff submitted a preliminary draft of the OWP to Caltrans and federal agencies to review to make sure the planned activities are consistent with the funding source. And then, oops, sorry. And then in March, which is this March meeting, staff is seeking the committee and board actions to release the draft OWP and budget for public comment. And in April, staff will bring the final budget and OWP back to the board for adoption, which will incorporate any comments from the state and federal agency and also comments from public if there is any, so that staff can submit the final budget and OWP to Caltrans and federal agency for final approval to begin expenditures starting July 1st of 2025. So I just want to quickly highlight what's included in the OWP work plan activities. To continue implementing SACOG mission and goals and deliver on our metropolitan transportation plan and sustainable community strategy, also known as the blueprint. The work plan for fiscal year 2025-26 continue to focus on the 4 priorities, which our Deputy Executive Director, Casey Lazan, presented the detailed 2005 work plan to the board at the January meeting. So I'm just going to quickly touch on those 4 priorities and some of the project that is included with the OWP. First one is the priority number 1, which is build vibrant and inclusive places. Some of the projects within this priority include Green Means Go program and also the Engage, Empower Implementation program, also known as the EEI. The second priority is foster the next generation of mobility solutions. Project include Mobility Zone, which is funded with the Grace Grant. Priority number 3, modernize the way we pay for transportation infrastructure. This is also including the Regional Express Link Network, and also known as CARTA's work. And lastly, the 4th priority is build and maintain a safe, equitable, and resilient transportation system. This including the regional funding round. These are just some of the priority programs that are included with the OWP document. Obviously, SACOG as a metropolitan planning organization and also as a regional transportation planning agency, there are other activities that are all required to carry out throughout the fiscal year. Before I go into the budget detail, I just want to give some basic information regarding SACOG budget, And then because SACOG budgets is a little bit unique in the sense that it's different from the member jurisdictions. So just going to quickly highlight some of the budget information. So first, SACOG manage a total of 3 different budgets, I would say. 2 is within the SACOG Planning and General Administration Fund. This including the operation budgets that included all the OWP activity that I just highlighted, and also the board and advocacy budget, which includes technical assistance to member jurisdictions, federal advocacy updates, partnerships, and board meeting, and some other expenses related to board. And then the 3rd budget is the CVR SAFE budget. This is a budget related to expenses for the freeway emergency services for the 6th county plus the El Dorado and also San Joaquin. The SACOG CVR board adopt its own budget at the June meeting, but its activity is also included in the overall work program. Secondly, SACOG budget includes significant pass-through funding. These include the Green Means Go funding, which I can go into a little bit more detail shortly. So it fluctuates year from year in terms of what SACOG budget looks like. And then also just want to highlight the timing of some of the expenditure. Because of these significant pass-through funding, sometimes the actual expenses can be delayed or lagged due to the timing of when those expenditures incurred by the member jurisdiction or begin implementing program, and also timing of the reimbursement that is submitted for these pass-through grants. And obviously, the consulting cost sometimes varies also depending on when the timing of starting of those projects. And lastly, I want to mention a little bit about the use of reserve. Typically, when SACOG start planning the budget, it always started using some of the fund balance, but throughout the fiscal year, we work hard to either bring in additional grant award or actively managing the budget, so where we can fill that gap. And historically, over the last couple of years, we've been successful in doing that and not have to dip into the fund balance. So what are some of the revenue source SACOG receive and included in SACOG budgets? So first, SACOG as a MPO or Metropolitan Planning Organization for the 6 county receive a planning, programming, and monitoring fees from the federal governments related to these activities. SACOG as the Regional Transportation Planning Agency receive planning, programming, and monitoring fee, and also fee for administering the transit-related funds, which including the Transportation Development Act, known as TDA, also the State Transit Assistance, and also the State of Good Repair funds. SACOG as a Council of Governments receive membership due. As I mentioned earlier, these fees are to pay for federal lobbying activities, technical assistance for member jurisdictions, and board expenses. And lastly, competitive grants. SACOG continue to apply for competitive grant that will supplement SACOG work, or as a lead agency to apply for those funds and pass through to member jurisdictions. The RCN grant is a good example of that, where SACOG act as a lead agency for those for the grant award, and the fund is being passed on to member jurisdictions to implement project within the green zone. So for fiscal year 2025-26 draft budgets for the Planning and Administration General Fund budget, as I noted, this includes the operation budgets that cover all the work plan activities, and then also the board and advocacy budgets. Total revenue and fund balance expected for the fiscal year is $49.2 million. This includes total revenue of approximately $47.8 million, and then use of fund balance, which I will go into a little bit more detail in the next slide, of approximately $1.4 million. Federal revenue makes up 46% of the overall budget. This includes the fees and programming fee that SACOG receive as an MPO, and also largely is the RCN grant, which is a pass-through grants to member jurisdictions. State revenue makes up 40%, and that is the REAP 2 Green Means Go funding, same thing that is also passed on to member jurisdictions. And local is approximately 11%. That is the fees for administering the transit-related program for the 4 county, and some of the monitoring programming fees. So this is an overview of the total expenditures for the proposed fiscal year, $49.2 million, an increase of approximately $6.2 million compared to the current fiscal year. And then this is largely related to the RCN Green Means Go pass-through funding. Staff costs and benefit makes up about 28% of the total budget. Pass-through costs, that makes up over 50% of the overall SACOG budget. And then again, this is mainly related to the pass-through funding for the Green Means Go program. And other costs is about 8%. Consulting costs is about 10%, which is slightly under comparing to the current fiscal year. This is largely due to some completion of some of the discretionary grants, and also the work related to the Blueprint EIR project. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the use of fund balance. As I noted earlier, included in the proposed budget is use of approximately $1.4 million of fund balance. This includes the SACOG managed fund, and some restricted funding of $453,000. This is used for the race grant match and also the community design grants. The board previously took actions to approve the use of these funds for these programs. However, because the expenditures span over multiple fiscal year, so staff is just programming the funds into it based on the anticipated expenditures for the fiscal year. Secondly, staff has proposed using $225,000 of the pension trust to pay for the increases in the unfunded pension liability payment. So the current balance in the trust is approximately 2.1 million. And lastly, this included in the use of fund balance include the carryover expenses of 434,000. In this current fiscal year, the board approved the use of 900,000 in fund balance for discretionary grant match and also consulting costs related to the Blueprint EIR and also the EEI program. Because some of these work will not be completed in the current fiscal year, so it will be carried over into next fiscal year. So totals approximately 1.4 million is included in the proposed budget. I just want to give an overview of what the different category of fund balance that SACOG has and what the estimate fund balance as of June 30th, 2025. And then also projected balance as of June 2026 based on the proposed budget. So under the category of restricted and committed, this including the SACOG managed fund that I mentioned earlier, that including funds set aside for the race grant match, for the EEI program, and then also for the community design grants. That is included in that 4.5 million total there. Pension trust, like I said, currently it's approximately 2.1 million, and then with the use of 225,000, we projected that the balance at end of June 30th, 2026 will be approximately 2 million. SACOG unassigned managed fund is approximately 7.5 million. SACOG also have various operating reserve that is add up to approximately about 3.8 million. We had not proposed any increase to the operating reserve over the last couple of years. So as staff is completing the current fiscal year amendment, we might be bringing back maybe recommendation if it's feasible to increase that operating reserve just to make sure that we have a 3-month worth of operating expenditure that per our policy that we should be set aside. So currently we are, I would say we're approximately close to 1.5 months. So it's not enough right now to cover the full 3 months. So as is feasible, staff will come back with recommendations to do that. Then unassigned fund balance right now is projected to be 5.3 million with the use of 453,000 in unassigned fund balance in the proposed budget there. Lastly, I want to just quickly touch on this 5-year baseline forecast that staff prepared last year in response to board question about the continued use of fund balance and also how it would affect SACOG long-term financial health. So this forecast was done last year and it was presented to the Policy and Innovation Committee in last October. It included in current year budget and also rolling forecast for the next 4 year ending fiscal year 2028-29. The intent of this forecast was just to provide a baseline of SACOG operating expenses and offer some insight to what SACOG know about staff know about SACOG finances over the next few years. As you can see from the chart, obviously there's no huge concern in terms of the impact for fiscal year 25, 26, 26, 27. The projected revenue are sufficient to cover the expenditures. However, starting in fiscal year 27, 28, we'll see a dip in a decline in revenue. This is due to the ending of the Green Means Go funding program and also the RACE grant, and then which also covers some of staff costs. Staff did presented some options to how to balance the budget or cover the shortfall in those fiscal year. Obviously, this is still a few years out. There's still a lot of unknown as how much revenue SACOG can receive during this period of time. So as things change, staff will come back with any recommendation or suggestions. And then also just SACOG has been successfully in winning discretionary grant over the last 5 years and have been really actively managing the expenses. So since 2020, we had added over $5 million to fund balance. So we will continue actively managing that. And then, as I mentioned, once the board adopted the budget, we will update the forecast. And then if there's any changes to any major factor that might impact SACOG finances long-term, we'll bring back to the Policy and Innovation for discussions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk about the salary schedule and then also the public hearings.
Thanks, Loretta. So just two brief things that wanted to highlight that are different with the budget we're bringing forward this year. Previously, we've brought the salary schedule separately. We thought we could just bring this in since we're already coming up with the costs. And so this is an attachment to the item today to recommend to the board to approve an update to the salary schedule. For new members, SACOG has a single bargaining unit, and that agreement goes through June of 2027. That has a cost of living adjustment based on the California CPI from the 2 prior Decembers. So based on that, it's 3.0% as of December 2024. So that's included in the budget already. That's attachment L. And then the second item is a new state requirement effective January 1st that every public agency in California has to hold a hearing before adopting its final budget on vacancies. And then if the vacancy rate is above 20%, there's additional requirements that kick in. SACOG has a pretty low vacancy rate of 5%. And so this will actually be a hearing that takes place at the board meeting in March, since it has to be before the full governing board. But I wanted to explain it a little bit, see if there's any questions today from the committee on that new requirement. And those are the two things I wanted to highlight. And then Loretta, you want to?
Thank you. So yeah, so this morning staff is recommending that the Policy Innovation Committee recommend to the board to release the draft budget and OWP for fiscal year 25-26 for public comment, and also to adopt the updated salary schedule that Eric just mentioned, and also hold a hearing regarding the vacancy at the March board meeting. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions or welcome any discussions on the budget item.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your in-depth discussion and explanation of our budget and also for our FY, our vacancies as well. Are there any questions from the board of directors at this time or? No questions.
Very good.
Yes, I'm sorry. I can't,
problem.
the blinding lights. So.
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
It's a vision. Just on the salary schedules, since we're already in a bargaining agreement, we signed a contract, do we still have to then approve it each year, even though it's contractually
So
already been approved?
our understanding, at least is the interpretation of the CalPERS regulations is that we have to adopt a salary schedule every single year. So yeah, it's very pro forma, but that's what we're doing.
All right, got
I want to
it.
get
Thank you.
sideways with CalPERS.
That's a good question because I think that generally our city adopts it in the budget, as part of the budget process as opposed to taking a separate action to do that. With that said, I did see, it looks like the salaries are monthly, yes. And then for intermittent and temporary, it's on an hourly rate. So that's not really a question on that, but okay. Are there any other questions? I guess I also wanted just to mention, you had indicated that we have a policy of SACOG to have a 3-month supply, our fund balance be at 3 months, right? A reserve.
That's correct, yes.
And right now we're at a month and a half.
I would say, yeah,
And-
10 and a half and 2, yeah, roughly.
And has that been the trend? I'm trying to remember what it was last year. Are we, because I know we kind of dip into reserves. We've been doing that.
So that is separate from the unassigned fund balance. So the operating reserve, which is the approximately 3.7 million, that also included legal reserve, some of the capital equipment. So the actual and then 1 million in contingency. So the actual operating reserve is of approximately 2.1 million.
Oh.
So that had not changed over the last couple of years because we obviously with some decrease in revenue, so staff have not proposed to assign additional unassigned fund balance to the operating reserve. But as we continuing monitoring the budget, and that was just something that we would consider doing as we finalize the, the budget for the next fiscal year. And then also staff is working on the amendment to the current year budget. So if there's any changes or if we see that there is room for increasing that operating expense reserve, we will definitely make that recommendations.
Okay, at a later time if it's appropriate. Okay, good. All
Chair, I
right.
have a comment.
Yes,
I think that's really scary for me. Only a month and a half of reserves. And I would make a very strong recommendation that we do what we need to do. If we have to cut somewhere to make sure that we have enough reserves to sustain our minimum of 3 months. I just don't kind of understand that we're kind of trudging on to continue with the expenditures when we're actually not meeting our minimum obligation to the reserve fund, so.
Thank you.
yeah, and it sounds like it's the unassigned fund balance versus the reserves.
Yes.
We have two separate, and that's why I'd asked that question, because it
Thank
sounds like we still have our reserves that we're not touching, but this is the unassigned fund balance. So a little bit different, but I don't like to dip into reserves either. I'm very, careful about that. Any other questions or comments at this time? Any public comment on this item, Madam Clerk?
There's no public comment.
All right, I'm going to bring it back to the committee. This is an action item, and what is the pleasure of the committee? Is there a motion to approve the budget and work plan and salary schedule?
Madam Chair, I will so move.
All right,
Second.
it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, can we do a voice vote, Madam Clerk, or do we need to do a roll call?
You can just do a voice vote.
All right, those in favor, please say aye.
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 Those opposed, say nay. Let the record show the motion has been adopted unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Yeah.
staff. Next item on the agenda, this is an informational item on Capital Area Regional Tolling Authority loan and staffing services. Eric, that's yours.
Yes, good morning. This is an informational item this morning. Last year, SACOG provided a loan to the Capital Area Regional Tolling Authority, or CARTA, which SACOG, YTD, and Caltrans are the first members of this new Joint Powers Authority. As it is a new entity and it is going to be overseeing all the regional toll services in the region. Since there are no toll services, there is no revenue to account for that. And so in its first year, SACOG provided a loan from the SACOG Managed Fund, which is one of the subsets of our reserves that Loretta touched on in the prior item. As we come up on the close of the current fiscal year, CARTA has asked SACOG to provide a second year loan for that. And we've done some analysis to look at that specific funding that's set aside for transportation projects and other purposes, again, the SACOG Managed Fund subset. And we think that we can provide another loan to CARTA. However, we've indicated to the other members of CARTA that SACOG does not want to continue to provide loans after this year, just because we want to have the flexibility for other purposes. And I think realistically, as we look out over multiple years before CARTA opens to revenue service in 2028, that it's really not feasible and get us, too low in that specific balance to have SACOG continue to do loans. And so at the same time that CARTA is asking SACOG for a loan, SACOG is also working with the other CARTA partners to find additional revenues to pay for those additional years of pre-revenue service for CARTA. So that's the first part that I wanted to inform and get some feedback from the committee about. The second piece is on staffing. And so in its first year, SACOG provided all the staffing services to CARTA and was reimbursed through this loan for those services so that there was no impact to SACOG's budget on that. In the second year, CARTA is looking at, based on some feedback from SACOG and also it moving into a more technical phase of the YOLO 80 project, that SACOG is actually reducing the staffing support and looking to consulting services to bridge the point from CARTA being staffed fully by SACOG to CARTA hiring an executive director anticipated in the 2 fiscal years from now. And so we're going to be bringing back to the board next month staffing services agreement that just makes it really clear kind of what's SACOG's responsibility, what's CARTA's responsibility, so that there's no miscommunication as we have additional parties kind of entering into who's responsible for what with respect to CARTA. So happy to take any questions or facilitate discussion about this item.
All right, I have a couple comments, but I'm going to ask my colleagues here. Are there any comments or questions on this item?
Just
Yes.
a quick question. What are the terms on that loan? Are they slowly paying it back? Or are we waiting till
Yeah.
it's open?
Sure. So the terms of the initial loan, and we propose doing the same this time, is essentially the SACOG funds sit in Sacramento County Treasurer's Office, and so we get the LAIF rate on that. And so we're just asking that they reimburse us at that same rate. And so repayment of the loan doesn't begin until revenue service kicks in. There's some flexibility built in there depending on if, revenue is not hitting exactly what they need, but essentially it's not until revenue starts flowing after 2028.
And that was about a 4.5% interest, give or take, right now, right?
Right,
on
yeah, it
that?
fluctuates, but that's right.
Are there other questions or comments?
Eric, has the
Yes.
relationship been cordial, no problems? Don't expect anything in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been cordial. It is a startup, and so it's challenging, right? And it was a bit of a rushed marriage to create this entity because of the grant timelines on the YOLO 80 project. But the partners have been really great. It really has been kind of it's shown the need for the purpose of this, right? Because there are so many impacts of the YOLO 80 project on the rest of the region. It's really important that SACOG created CARTA so that we're at the table, Caltrans is at the table, no one entity is kind of doing its own thing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have any of our other partners indicated they're willing to do future loans? I mean, I know you said we're just starting to talk to them, but what's the backup plan when we say no another year?
Sure. So that's something we're actively working on. I think they all want to find a solution. None of them have, perhaps with the exception of Caltrans, which has its own complications, right? None of them have really deep pockets. And so among the options are potentially seeking a loan from the State Infrastructure Bank, but we're definitely trying to nail that down in the next few months, how we might do
Bless you.
that.
Bless you.
But also, right, capitalizing it into either the YOLO 80 project or future projects in Sacramento County. We're trying to look at all those options to make sure that CARTA gets off the ground and that, we're repaid and the other, potential lenders are repaid.
Yes, thank you. I had the same question on that front, so thank you very much for asking it and for answering. I'm wondering now, with regards to staffing, because obviously we're not providing full-time staffing, but are we keeping track of that on an hourly basis? Because you're saying we're being reimbursed for that time, and so how much approximate staff time have we lent to this effort so far?
That was my question too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't have the exact number in front of me. We can definitely bring that back next month. It has been under the estimate, and so it's fractional. For instance, right, myself and Christina Spence, our transportation director, work with Kathleen Hanley, who's kind of been our lead staff on this. And so, in any given week, I'm spending between 0 and 4 to 6 hours on CARTA related things. And SACOG, because of that OWP that Loretta went through, we already have staff doing detailed project level billing. And so we're tracking our hours specific to CARTA.
So when this item comes to the full board for consideration, if we could just maybe include that information in there so
Absolutely.
that the other board members will have that as well. And it is interesting, I aside from Caltrans, no one really else has the funds necessary to provide that loan. So it's concerning to me because I know that we initially approved 1.3, we're going for another 1.3. And, toll service isn't going to begin till 2028. So there are a number of years, but you said that they're looking into the state's infrastructure loan as well. So that would be CARTA applying for those funds, and
That's
we
right.
would not have to be involved in that process. It would just be CARTA, correct?
We would, we have to look into that a little bit more, right? As a JPA technically, right? All of
Us, but
kind
I
of
mean,
sharing
CARTA
it,
would take the,
But
I mean,
CARTA would
yeah,
be the legal entity
as opposed to
entering into the
Caltrans.
loan,
I mean,
yes.
because I can't, Caltrans throwing in or providing a loan isn't, I don't, that's a
It-
whole
it-
nother structure, but, because that's something that I just think about because we've got, till 2028 or 2025. And so there are a number of years that are still left where funding is going to be necessary until they're up and running. And even after that, after they're up and running and collecting that revenue, they're gonna need to sustain themselves and then start paying us back. So we might not see money till 2030, I don't know.
Right.
But appreciate that and thank you very much for
Absolutely. Yeah.
nailing down that issue on the staff time so far.
Yeah.
Yes,
One other question, is it written that when they are able to repay the loans, do we get to come first before Caltrans or the state? I mean, how are they gonna balance that if they're pulling multiple loans from other sources, I mean, different sources?
Yeah, so we do have we're pretty high up in terms of the creditors right on this because there's no other loans, but certainly that would be something that we would be a party to and be taking a close look at and commenting if there's an issue with kind of the primacy of who's in the loans. I'll just note too that SACOG does have two seats on the CARTA, voting seats on the CARTA board, so definitely we have a voice in this and an interest in making sure that SACOG gets repaid and it's all equitable. On the staffing front, I just highlight too that we have been trying to run this pretty lean because we know that we're not going to be having the types of toll revenue that they're taking in Southern California or even the Bay Area. And so we're definitely making sure that it's a system that works, but it's also done pretty efficiently given our region size.
appreciate that. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions on this item?
Madam Chair, can I just add a few things if
Oh,
you
hi,
can hear me
James.
okay?
Yes.
Yeah, a few things just because I know some of you were here last year during the beginning of CARTA, but some of you weren't. So Eric mentioned this is a startup, and it really is, right? And great questions you all have asked. We're looking to get this second loan into CARTA so we can help stand them up as a startup. And as Eric said, we don't want to continue to be and you don't want to continue to be the sole source of financing, right? And it is financing rather than grants. But it is very important that this is successful because this really is as Loretta went through our sort of, priorities in the work program a second ago. This is the next generation of really how we're going to be able to finance our freeway network. So it's the success of CARTA, I think, is important for the rest of the region's freeway network, express lanes, everything else. So we want them to succeed, obviously. And secondly, I would just say this is the only toll authority in the state of California that actually has local elected officials and Caltrans sitting at the table. And that makes it sometimes more complicated, but it also makes it, I think it's the exact right way to go, right? This is why we are here. We're here and the conversations we've had at CARTA, I think really are excellent conversations, open, transparent, public dialogue, public meeting, just back and forth with Caltrans and all of you as local elected officials. And I'm saying that by way of saying this is part of that startup and innovation and experiment, but it's the right thing to do and the right way to approach this. And because this is the only one where Caltrans is a voting member, we're certainly hoping we can get the state's attention in terms of being able to come in with additional financing strategies. So stay tuned.
It definitely puts us in a better place, having that regional and partnership and with the state as well. So I agree with you. Thank you very much, James. All right, any other discussion on this item? And I think I asked for public comment, Madam Clerk. Is there any public comment?
There's no public comment.
All right, I'm going to, actually, we don't have any action. This is just an informational item at this time. So thank you very much, staff. I'm looking forward to continued updates. Next item on the agenda, we have an advocacy update.
Great. Good morning, Renee DeVioca, part of your government affairs team staff. So we have two updates within this item as usual. We'll start off with our federal update and then jump over to our state update. So as you can see, James is back in DC. So he's back there for our Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, so one of our membership organizations. We go to policy conference. He's also back there with Christina Lockey, our Director of Government Affairs. So I'm saying triple duty because he spoke on Sunday at the National League of Cities, meeting with our delegation and also for that conference. I don't know, James, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I guess I haven't, we're heading up to the Hill pretty soon. It was great though, I will just say to be, and I assume some of you have been back to the National League of Cities who are city officials. Obviously we have our own, former president here in David Sander, who was president of NLC. It was really, really good to be able to speak to a pretty packed room of local city officials, all of whom sit on MPO boards like yourselves. And we're going to need each other in the next couple of years, right? As we reauthorize the transportation bill, as we try to get a budget passed, as we really work very hard to get investment into our projects. So also did a little bit of a preview tour for the Cap to Cap pre-tour that many of you have signed up for. So I don't have any insights yet. Maybe that's Jason's responsibility into how things are happening and how they're shaping up in Congress. But I will say it was great to see so many city officials really hungry to understand the relationship and the sort of teamwork between cities and counties and MPOs.
Yeah, so we'll hand it over to Jason. Maybe you can give us the highlights of what's going on there this week. Something like a
Thanks, yeah,
March
Renee,
14th.
and hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm actually sitting next to Devin. We've got this meeting with this really, really demanding executive director in a little bit here. So we've been strategizing on how to deal with him. Yeah, so a lot going on this week. That Congress, we hope, will be finalizing a fiscal year 25 budget to avoid a government shutdown. Effectively, the House wrote a bill that I think can generally be described as somewhat clean. It took just enough off of certain programs and added just enough to Border Patrol and others that it makes Democrats not want to pass it, but it puts them in a real tough position to say no to it. The margins are such in the House that it is likely they will lose a handful of Republicans just because there are certain Republicans who vote against the budget almost every year. So I think some Democrats are needed in the House, and certainly 7 will be needed in the Senate. I think it's going to be touch and go. The House plans on voting on their funding bill tomorrow and then leaving for an early spring recess that will last through next week, sort of putting the Senate in a very tough position of take it or shut down the government for 10 days. Which is, obviously if they were to not pass it, it's very possible Congress would come back early, but it's just one of those tactics that it makes it that much more difficult to get a bill done. People are angry. So I think if I had to guess right now, I'm probably 60-40 that the full year continuing resolution would pass. And that's just sort of one of many hurdles that this Congress has to deal with. I was fortunate enough to be in Sacramento last week speaking at the California Council of Governments. I'm going to refer to, I think, the current status of things as I did then is that, one of the challenges we have right now is there's this ball of dust that the Trump administration is using almost on purpose in all aspects of government, particularly though in transportation where it's making bold statements and there are rumors out there that, oh my God, they're going to rescind unobligated money, and no, they're not, but yes, they are. They're going to shut down division offices. No, they're not, but yes, they are. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of a lack of clarity, and not really anything official. That is something that we're noticing with this administration is they are not sort of, certainly acting by decree in the sense of executive orders. But implementation of those executive orders sort of hems and haws and depends what day it is. So it's very tough to put a finger on what exactly is happening, for lack of better words, and what the next day will hold, let alone what the next week and next month will hold. But I think we'll continue to see the strategy of creating a ball of dust, ball of confusion, in hopes that organizations like yours grind to a halt. And what I would say to you is, keep doing what you're doing. I think that this administration, in addition to sort of strategically doing this, it's also a little bit of trial and error. They're throwing policy trial balloons out, seeing what the reaction is, seeing what they can get away with legally, and then drawing back. We've seen that with the tariffs. We're seeing that with a lot of things. So I think that the most important advice is to remain focused on the job at hand, remain focused on the work you're doing, and things will settle down, will settle out. With that, let me sort of stop and ask Devin if she has anything that she wants to add. She is shaking her head no, but that is sort of where we are at, and I'm more than happy to take any questions or fill in any blanks, Renee, that you or James or others may want me to fill in.
Thank you very much. I do have a quick question. I read that the DOT is rescinding the DEI programs and policies, and I just wonder, with the stand that the federal government is taking on those issues, how that could potentially affect SACOG. Because we are very much moving forward with our policies and addressing those issues, which the state is very supportive of. So I'm just wondering if there's any potential impact to us.
I mean, there's certainly, it's very clear this administration is sort of deprioritizing, undoing, whatever words we want to choose, some of the efforts of the Biden administration to focus on equity and diversity. Certainly it's going to eventually be a legal test on what they can do. There's entire sections of code, sections of law that basically says local governments have the right and unabashed right to select projects and do things as long as they're authorized and legal within the programs, which in many programs includes equity-focused analysis. However, I think that there's a little bit of, are you looking for trouble or are you looking to get a job done? I always use the analogy, do you want to be an activist or do you want to be an advocate? Activists fight for what's right and talk about the issue. Advocates try to get things over the finish line. So I think certainly I know a lot of MPOs around the nation are scrubbing their work plans, are looking at their websites, are doing things to get rid of keywords. Because something I should note here is this administration is very much using AI to screen things. So it's not like there's a staffer reading all of the plans and counting the number of times diversity or carbon reduction are brought up. They're using AI. So if you sort of wash your documents of those adjectives where you can, you don't pop up on the screen. But there are certainly obviously those advocates and those organizations that want to fight for this being an important issue. And they're willing to go toe to toe with the administration. That's an answer for you guys to decide where you want to be on that. But I will say, for those avoiding the fights, they're just looking for those keywords and taking them out as much as possible. Certainly with projects, there's going to be, I think, a pending legal battle in terms of what the administration can and can't do in terms of projects that have been awarded and different state of awarding, meaning do they have a project grant agreement? Has the grant been announced? We can discuss those on projects on an individual basis, but I think in general going forward, certainly whether it's an MPO work plan or a discretionary grant that a city is putting forward, the key words that this administration sort of is railing against should not be included in those applications or those documents.
Thank
Madam
you.
Chair,
And
can
yes,
Go ahead.
James, I was going to suggest maybe you say something. So thank you.
Yeah, look, we've been certainly preparing for either outcome from the last election, right, for quite some time, and nobody could predict everything, but we definitely foresaw some challenges with the current administration. And I'll just say a few things. And obviously, nobody knows still kind of how this is all going to play out, right? So the first thing I'd say is the grants that we've already received, and those are really show up through mobility zones and the work of those mobility zones. We're being very, very thoughtful about this, and I think many of you have heard the presentations from our staff. that we are using race ethnicity, but we are not only using race ethnicity, right? We are using income, you're using geography, rural areas, to look at not just disadvantage, but transportation disadvantage. We're using a lot of community-based organizations and local, your staff to actually right-size that based on the county and the geography. And if you just look at even the cases on this, all of those things are put us in a better legal standing, we believe, on that work. And we also think it's much more genuine and very bottom up. A lot of the work that we're doing with the REI, the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group, led by Director Jennings, is locally funded. That has always been that case, and we knew that's important. And then what Jason just mentioned, I would say, is the last bucket of things, which everybody across the entire country is in. Remember, we had a administration in the last 4 years that prioritized equity, and it was in your grant. If you wanted to win a grant the last 4 years, it was in there, right? So that, I think, is still a bit of the unknown, is potential rescissions, potential existing grants. We have just done a scan of all the grants that are in our region that have been awarded the last, say, 12 months that have not been signed. And those are the high risk. It's all risk. There's all risk, but those are the highest risk. And then, of course, going forward, we're thoughtful about the audience and USDOT and HUD and every other agency. And so we have to sort of parse it, I think, a little bit about this work that's underway, the fund source we're using, the commitment this board has made to disadvantaged communities, using all kinds of data layers throughout the region, right sizing it by geography. And we are absolutely still waiting to sort of hear, are there grants that will be pulled? Are there grants that will be scrubbed? We know of some federal agencies that have asked some of our jurisdictions to go in and change language on existing grants. So that's very possible that will still come. And we do have a number, we have to say, of grants that are out there that have not been signed with a grant agreement from the prior administration. And so that's important work to make sure that we're undertaking.
And I noticed too that the feds are also putting more attention towards areas where there are higher marriage rates and more childbirths. So, rolling that into our mix, I think, would be beneficial as well. I appreciate the pledge and the commitment that SACOG has made. Thank you for reminding us that our REI efforts are locally funded. I appreciate the reminder on that. Just as much as I've been talking about when we're going after funding and talking about, the Green Means Go, talking about economic development and how transportation is spearheading jobs, spearheading, business growth and things, our economic development, things of that nature. We have to be just cognizant on this other side too. There's a balance to be achieved, and it's a challenge, and I'm sure that time will tell as well. But just so that we continue to be very mindful, because the message has been, made over and over again. And the fact that they are using AI versus a person who's going to take a look at all those layers and see all the good work that SACOG has done. AI doesn't care about any of that. They just pull words. And so just, it's something that we have to be mindful, of course. And I know that we are, but I at this point I had to mention it, since we were going to talk about our federal advocacy and our state advocacy. So thank you, James. Thank you.
Madam Chair, just
Yes.
on the point of the marriage and birth rates, right? That is something that's come from the new Secretary of Transportation. I think it's a good example to kind of unpack, like, where might this go in regards to federal policy, right? I think where we would anticipate that really showing up is when there's new discretionary grants coming from the Department of Transportation.
We hope. We never know. I mean, we just don't know.
Well, right, but I mean, to be clear, right, I think the formula funding that comes to our regions, like, that is written by Congress, like, that can't be changed. And so the amount of funding that SACOG is awarding out, like, that won't change based on any administration's policies. But just as James mentioned, right, equity was an emphasis in the prior administration. Focus on families is a priority of this administration. But when you look at some of the metrics of, like, how do you actually define what it is to do that, it's not that dissimilar from some of the priorities of the prior administration. And so once there's actually grants that are being let out to apply for, like, that's something where we'll work with local jurisdictions to see, what areas will compete well in our region, and how do we work in this new environment.
And part of it is really semantics, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, there are ways to demonstrate the high marriage and childbirth rates and showing how that happens in some other, perhaps disadvantaged communities. I mean, again, it's semantics. So, and I know that we have very talented staff that work for us and will help us navigate through this process, but it is something that we need as a board to be mindful of course. So, any other discussion? Yes, Dr. Gallego.
I appreciate both Jason and James touching on the agreements that we have in place, but I keep hearing even signed agreements are at risk. I guess, so when we know we have a grant and we have a signed agreement, do we have the money, or do we just think it's coming? Because I think there's still some challenges coming with that.
Everything's on the table.
Jason, you want to?
Yeah, this is part of the ball of dust. I mean, if you really want to look at it from a legal's perspective, a signed contract is an obligation from the federal government to give money. But again, it's a little bit of like the Matrix, right? Like we're used to following the rules and following the law. Again, without trying to enter in political commentary, this administration is seeing how far they can bend that. And in some cases, they are breaking it before they get turned back. I think there's less risk, but I would not say no risk. And that for me is a big statement to make because I'm a big rule follower and my little kids are little justice warriors who feel like if you step out of line and cut the line, you're a bad person. But, I feel like that is sort of where we're at now is the answer should be there's no risk. But I think with this administration, I can't be Pollyannish and say there is no risk, but you would have a heck of a legal argument. And again, I think if you really push came to shove, you would get the money, but you may spend as much time fighting it in court as you would get with the money. But again, I'm not suggesting that is what will happen, but we also cannot close the door on the possibility it could happen. But there's less risk there than a project that does not have a signed grant agreement.
Sure.
And I appreciate that because I think that's weighing on all of us in our jurisdictions and here, how secure we feel in even starting some of these projects till we know where we're at.
And that's what they want. That's part of the goal of the ball of dust is to freeze you up just enough where you begin to think about, do we really want to do this? And if they get 25% of you to say no, that's $250 million. Just looking at Safe Streets for All, for example. So.
Thank you, I think, for reinforcing why I don't sleep well every once in a while.
I say sleep fine to keep doing what you're doing, and that's why God made lawyers. That's the only reason I can think of why they made them, but neither here nor there.
Oh.
I mean, my wife's a lawyer, so I should recognize that too.
Okay. All right. Is there any further comment or discussion? Yes.
I just have a quick question, and maybe it's not specific to SACOG, but certainly the members. I know that part of the discussion for the tax reform is taxing municipal bonds. Have you heard any further on that? Because that definitely for those entities that have infrastructure bonds and all of those kind of things out there, that could be a significant impact on the individual members.
So nothing substantial, nothing beyond the Senate budget or the House Budget Committee released an extensive list of what's known as tax expenditures. Those are, breaks in the tax code, everything from the transit benefit to, how we handle municipal ponds, et cetera, et cetera. The committees have not begun work yet. What I will say is, at least in the House side, what's called the budget notes were not awful. So Ways and Means doesn't have to come up with like $4 trillion of tax savings, but they have to come up with some. So that list will not be as long as it probably could have been. The other thing I will say is, though, sort of the other side of that coin is saving the 2017 or I think the 2018 tax law and extending it is without question the top priority for President Trump. So as they get more desperate to do this, it would not surprise me that this is on the table. But again, they're going to need 218 yes votes, which means that they can lose no more than one, maybe two Republicans. And the difference between the far right on the right and the middle of the right is extreme. So, you know, you talk about taxing municipal bonds, there's a lot of highly invested communities, both in California, New York, and some other places, where you begin to put taxes on that and it becomes a problem for certain members of Congress. So that's the dynamics they're gonna have to deal with. So, you know, I think, you know, they're gonna have to look for the path of least resistance, and I'm not sure taxing municipal bonds is one of those paths.
Okay, thank you. Any last minute questions or concerns on this item? All right, it's informational. Thank you very much. Appreciate the update, and we will look forward to future updates as well. Move on to other matters.
Hold
I
on.
just,
We have a state update as well.
oh, I apologize
two.
profusely. Well, I was moving right along, so we absolutely do.
Chris Lee from Political Code.
Yes, sorry. Sorry, we're just moving right along, so.
No worries, I can be brief or exhaustive, so. Good morning. Yep. Chris Lee with Politico Group. Eric, about how long do you guys want? Okay. Great. Don't have slides today. This is the time of year when things really haven't gelled quite yet. But a lot is going on in the legislature. So a couple weeks ago was the deadline for introducing bills, February 21st. 2,400 approximately bills, that's about 20 per member. If you recall, there's a new bill limit that's a little bit less than prior to your sessions of about 35. So while we still got a huge crop of bills this year, if those limits actually hold, we should have significantly fewer to look at in the second half of the session. I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation legislation, climate, housing, land use, and then budget, and very briefly touch on Brown Act related legislation. So again, feel free to interrupt with questions at any time, but I'll try to keep this to about 10 minutes. So on transportation, there was an informational hearing last week between the Senate and Assembly Transportation Committees. SACOG was featured as a witness at that hearing. And the goal was really to look at the impacts of California's electrification and other zero emission vehicle technologies on the future of the gas tax. The California Transportation Commission was charged with doing a transportation funding needs assessment for the state. And as part of that, they looked at what are the ongoing trends and are basically assuming that over the next decade, as the shift to zero emission vehicles proceeds, we'll lose about $31 billion in fuel tax revenue. And so as part of this effort, Assembly Transportation Chair Wilson has introduced AB 1421, which is currently a bill that just extends the authority for the state's existing road user charge task force. But this is likely to be a vehicle to have a broader conversation about what is the next funding source, how do we create an equitable and sustainable funding source for transportation, particularly as you see a lot of higher income people driving electric vehicles that just aren't paying the same amount of fuel tax revenues as lower income drivers, and therefore contributing a lot less to the maintenance of the system. Looking locally in the Sacramento region, there's a few safety bills that are kind of in the works. Both Senator Ashby and Assemblymember Nguyen have proposals that are not yet in print, but related to some of the transportation concerns, particularly in the city of Sacramento, related to the huge number of increases in deaths and fatalities and injuries on our roads, particularly as we're coming out of COVID. Moving on to talk a little bit about the climate change space, the governor's climate action plan for transportation infrastructure was out for comment. It was in a draft form late last year. That was released just Friday before last. And some of the changes in response to an outcry from regional agencies and others from around the state are really softening the prior proposal, which was, hey, let's just take the CAPTI and put it into statute. Instead, they're talking about what are guidelines and things that we can do to keep these principles going forward in the administration's program. And then the other area where I think we saw some pretty significant changes was related to the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. So this is a competitive SB1 grant program. And in that recommendation, they really softened the language that previously said we only want to fund VMT neutral projects. So for instance, a managed lane project on the freeway with tolling, there could be some VMT increase for that. That project would not be eligible under the prior version of this. Now what they're asking the CTC to do is across the whole suite of projects have a VMT neutral set of investments. Cap and trade has been quite the topic this year. There was an informational hearing about 2 weeks ago with the Joint Committee on Climate Change Policies. As you all recall, about 65% of the revenue that comes from cap and trade into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is continuously appropriated. A lot of that goes to transportation. I think my takeaway from the hearing where they were really talking about the fundamental structure of how cap and trade works and this broader concern about affordability for energy for consumers in California. I think there's a lot of interest in the legislature in thinking about that issue as they think about reauthorization. And so what does that mean? It means, I think, things like rebates. It means things like job training for people who are being displaced from some of these industries. And I think maybe puts a little bit of a tamp down on the sort of, I would say, feeding frenzy environment about people thinking, let's think about what we do with the GGRF revenue rather than how do we have a structure of a program that does reduce emissions, but also offsets the costs that are inherent in a market-based compliance mechanism for consumers. Sustainable community strategies, there's a handful of bills that are in print right now, mostly making really minor changes. Senator Cabaldon has one that's talking about enrollment in post-secondary institutions and how you plan the land uses and housing around that. There's a spot bill that we think is going to be a reintroduction of a bill last year that was a little bit problematic by member El Wahari from Los Angeles. And then in a series of bills, there's AB 902 by Schultz, which would basically require the SCS to start to consider wildlife movement. Folks might recall that there was a bill last year for cities and counties to do this in their general plans. And so we're taking a close look with the SACOG staff to think about the implications of that one. While there's just a handful of those bills that I mentioned right now, there are broader conversations happening about what does SB 375 look like? How do we deal with VMT mitigation? How do we deal with the state's climate goals that are beyond the current timeframe for the bill? And how do we focus on implementation efforts like Green Means Go, and how do we combine housing affordability into this conversation in a more specific and realistic way? So we're monitoring those conversations. Again, no major overhaul bills have been introduced yet in this legislative session, but we do expect that some of those bills could be a vessel for that conversation to proceed. Pivoting a little bit to talk just broader about housing and land use, we sent SACOG staff a memo. It has, dozens of housing bills that have been introduced. I've tagged at least 90. A ton of bills are still in non-substantive spot form, so we're expecting to see a lot of those get amended, particularly as we get to late March and early April. But one trend that's picking up steam is a lot of bills are coming out of this Assembly Select Committee on Permit Reform. That looked at housing, it looked at electricity, it looked at water, and it looked at transportation. That report was released last Tuesday and has some pretty high-level recommendations. And I think we're going to see a lot of bills on that. And so in the housing space, items that were include eliminating uncertainty in the application process. We've seen legislation that would require basically all cities and counties to use a standardized application for housing projects. That's not introduced yet. It's just a spot bill. Minimizing uncertainty in the entitlement process and talking about the interaction between the shot clocks in the Permit Streamlining Act and CEQA. moving CEQA to focus on environmental issues. So I've seen some middling and some not yet introduced more aggressive approaches to CEQA and streamlining, particularly infill housing. And so we'll see if there's opportunity to support anything on that front. And then post-entitlement permits, there's been a lot of legislation imposing new timeframes and shot clocks and restrictions on local governments. And there's some discussion about applying those to the utilities and the state. So a mixed bag there. I think some of those are going to be pretty difficult to deal with from a local government perspective, but there might be opportunities for some positive streamlining as well. On the transportation side, again, of that same effort, there's talk about consistency across local permitting agencies, particularly for interjurisdictional projects like a rail line or transit, removing inefficiencies from repeat engagements. So if you have to go get an encroachment permit every time you do a bus shelter, something like that. And then talking about distinct pathways for important transit and transportation projects. So Senator Wiener has reintroduced a bill that creates a CEQA exemption for certain types of, let's say, clean transportation projects, and we expect to see a lot more there. He also has a permit streamlining bill related to similar projects that has some very detailed requirements for all local permitting agencies that would be involved. Just a little bit on budget. These early budget hearings that happen really are an opportunity for the different houses to kind of stake out their general stance and their budget priorities. And so the takeaways from the early ones are from the Assembly side, housing and homelessness is one of the things that they're prioritizing very dearly, as well as ongoing accountability and oversight. Whereas on the Senate side, the first Senate budget hearing was focused on transit funding. And so we've seen members led by Senator Jesse Arreguín from Berkeley submit a $2 billion general fund request for transit. And so this is clearly a priority for the Senate side. On the Assembly side, there is a budget letter out there signed by the housing chair and I would say several dozen Assembly members looking for additional general fund for housing purposes, including, for SACOG's perspective, REAP funding. And so I've shared that letter with your staff as well. But all of this is happening in the context of a very uncertain, very complicated budget picture. There was a hearing in Assembly Sub 7, which is their oversight, kind of a generic, we want to take a detailed look at oversight and accountability issue by issue. That was focused on the amount of federal investment in California. And while some of us who work in transportation, I think, tend to think of, wow, the federal transportation program really is huge. It's a tiny slice of the revenues that the state of California gets from the federal government. And so in talking to my colleagues who work in the health and human services space, Medicaid matching funds, the FMAP, is a huge issue. I think the big takeaway is that while the state budget is on this course right now, revenues are actually performing better than anticipated. The February revenues were above estimates, even when accounting for the delayed filing dates as a result of the Los Angeles fires. There's huge uncertainty about that federal investment and the amount of reserves that California has on hand when we're talking about programs that are such, giant portions of the state budget is really going to make the budget a very complicated process this year. So my colleagues who work closely on these issues are already saying things like, I bet we'll be in budget special session, September, October, trying to deal with changes to these huge entitlement programs. And so that revenue weirdness is also something that's interesting. It's definitely not what we expected when there were delays. We're seeing changes in the stock market. So lots of uncertainty there, but again, staked out early priorities. And right now we're kind of in a status quo budget. I think we'll see in May a much more realistic presentation of the issues. And then finally, just very briefly, Brown Act, we'd highlighted for you previously the bills related to subsidiary committees and then the extension of those just cause flexibilities. There's also now a bill by the Senate Local Government Chair, Maria Elena Durazo, SB 707, which would require new access requirements and translation requirements. And so we are sort of setting up a competing bills, right? So you have the flexibility, the remote participation without all the subsidiary advisory committee members posting their locations and opening them to the public. And then the chair has staked out this other issue. And so I think these things are going, they're a bit on a collision course right now. So might not have too much of a different outcome, but that SB 707 is something we should also take a look at and weigh how much we value the other things that are being advanced on flexibility for remote participation. And so that is my attempt to run down a very fluid and busy time in the legislature, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Just really quickly, you said that the estimated loss of gas tax is projected at 31 million. What was the year?
31 billion over
Billion.
the decade.
Over
Yeah.
at the end of the
Yep.
decade?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And again, when the report was due, a lot of these other reports hadn't come out yet. So we'll include a more detailed write-up in the report that will come out next month. But
All right, by 2030. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Any public comment? Thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Sorry about that.
no worries.
All right, next item on the agenda is other matters, and I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Best and Krieger. Thank you very much for the hosting the CalCog Regional Forum dinner last week. It was really appreciated the opportunity to go and to meet the other members of the CalCog Board of Directors, the chair of which is my colleague on the League of Cities. Rolling Hill Estates City Councilwoman is chair of CalCog. I did not know that, so it was great to see her. I thought, what are you doing at the dinner? And she's, oh, I'm CalCog chair. Oh, well, there you go. So anyway, thank you very much. Are there any other comments?
Yes, Madam Chair, just wanted to remind the board members that the board meeting in Rockland coming up next week is having a tour before starting at 8:30.
Yes.
And the best donuts in the United States, right? So
Cinnamon or donuts and cinnamon? Okay, all right.
You couldn't get in because of that Yelp review for a while.
I know. Great, thank you very much. Looking forward to that. Yes. Okay, without objection, I'll adjourn. Seeing no further business before us, that shall be the order. Thank you, everyone.